Welcome to episode 22B of Successful Demo. In each episode, we analyze the theoretical and practical aspects of one newly released cards. We are back with our successful demo on Jinja City Grid. For those of you who don't remember, I'm going to play a 3-game set versus James Gray, who's playing Valencia, using this Jinja City Grid list in Asa Group. Now, because this was played before the White Null cards were implemented on jinteki.net, you'll notice that Jinja City Grid will not have any art and it will be manually implemented. So I seek your understanding. The video might be a bit harder to follow, but I'll try my best to keep you up to date on the board state with my commentary. So without further ado, let's go into Game 2. Now, I did say I would mulligan hard for a Jinja City Grid, or at least a clearance to draw into it, but this hand is just too good to give up. 3 economy operations and 2 ice, drawing into a third one on my mandatory draw. That's amazing. So as always, we always want to reserve Fairchild 3 for the remote, because it's such a powerful and taxing end run. It's best served on the remote rather than the centrals, which are adequately defended by Ichi and Architect. So here I install Fairchild 3 on the remote and use Asa Group to install the hedge fund in the remote before realizing that hedge fund wasn't an asset, so I put it swiftly back into my hand, taking back the Asa trigger. Kids, don't install hedge fund in your remote. You might get a game loss for that. Anyway, with my hand down to only 2 cards, this makes it pretty easy for my last 2 clicks. Just play the hedge fund, play the violet level, and with HQ guarded, it's going to be quite hard for my opponent to bring themselves to run HQ, even if I immediately drew into agendas, which I did not. There are no agendas in my hand, so even this Omar run isn't going to net anything. Alright, the big thing comes on my turn 3, where I mandatorily draw into the best possible card, Localized Product Line. I immediately use it for its intention in this deck. Search for J, that's Jinja City Grid. Now I'm going to bring up 2 of them here. I could tutor 3, I did not want to because there was no need to. And I'm going to use the Asa trigger to install another Fairchild on the remote. Before I play the violet level clearance for my last click, I remember to res the Jinja here. And I'm going to play the violet level clearance, which draws me Seda Barrier, Fairchild 2, Corporate Sales Team. That was an impressive draw from violet level clearance. I can install all 3 of this ice on the Jinja server. All of them for free. Remember, your first 5 ice are free. So the ordering is pretty easy. You want your end runs at the bottom of the server and your taxing ice on the top. So the Seda goes first as it's an end run, followed by the 2 Fairchild 2s, which don't actually end the run. So my opponent is forced to actually break the Fairchild 2 subroutines, because otherwise they'll be forced to trash their installed cards, which means that they potentially don't have the breaker to deal with the Seda barrier. So wow. Look at this server. I would like to remind you, this is my turn 3. I'm getting this sort of a board state. This stack of ice, most runners can't contest it until at the very least turn 8 or 9. This is a very huge scoring window for me, and I'm going to abuse that with the corporate sales team in my hand that my opponent isn't able to fetch. My opponent attempts to route over to my R&D to attempt an indexing, but they fall short. They are not going to get much off the top of R&D, which buys me a couple of turns to score the sales team from my hand. So yeah, that blind fam working somewhat well for my opponent. Not really, because femming an architect isn't exactly the best, but my opponent needed it to ensure they got the indexing through, because they knew that their only way to win was by centrals. There was no way my opponent was going to contest my remote. So I draw into lateral growth here. I'm going to lateral growth into the sales team and advance it. No need to trigger Asa Group here. I'm going to play the IPO here. With R&D completely showing no agendas for the next few cards, and my remote so secure, my opponent cannot do anything. I'm threatening with 17 credits. My opponent cannot break multiple rest ice. So I get this agenda scored for free, and I'll be digging for my next one very shortly. Mad dash into R&D. What is this? Oh my gosh, I got outplayed. My opponent outplayed me. They buried the Ikawa project, which I remembered to put in for this game. Knowing that they could not get the Ikawa project on the turn that they performed the indexing, they buried it at the exact correct spot and correctly predicted that I would not draw because I would be busy scoring an agenda. As a result, they get the mad dash of the Ikawa. That's 4 agenda points. They are technically on match point now because if they find the second Ikawa, they win the game on 2 agenda steals. This is really bad. So to defend against that, I'm going to do the ASA play of install Chrysium into install Ice on R&D. This way, our R&D is well defended and my opponent cannot pull off another indexing due to the Chrysium grid threat. Now they could Omar into R&D and trash the Chrysium, which is why I preemptively defended Archives here, making sure that they don't get an easy Chrysium trash into indexing, because that's how I lose the game. So yeah, this is a very secure remote. My opponent has no way through it right now, but I need to act quickly before my opponent scores the win. I play Ultraviolet level clearance here, and I could Jinja install the Fairchild that I just drew off it. I'm thinking about it right now, but first I'll do the Ultraviolet trigger and install the Fairchild 2 thereafter. So Ultraviolet installs the Ash. I would have definitely installed an agenda there, but there are no agendas to be had. And now my remote is 6 ice deep. Fairchild 2, Fairchild 2, Fairchild 2, Satyr Adaptive Barrier, Fairchild 1, Fairchild 3. You're not getting through that. No way. Not with Black Orchestra, you're not. So my opponent really only has Omar triggers as an option. And obviously there was going to be nothing in HQ, because if there were, it would go into my remote. And yes, indeed, my opponent is being forced out of their comfort zone. As this sort of Valencia / Omar deck, what you typically want to do is to lock the remote with Stim Hack. You don't run it unless there's a card advance in it, while you slowly plink away at centrals whenever you have a good card like Indexing or Mining Accident. However, my opponent cannot play that way. They have to play very aggressively on centrals to get agendas, because they know the remote is nigh uncontestable. They have to get through 6 pieces of ice, and even after that, they have to deal with the Ash at the bottom of the server. That is completely unreasonable, even with a last-ditch Stim Hack. So my opponent rightfully ignores this remote as I score my second sales team. Each of these sales teams giving me 10 credits, giving me more than enough money to res all the ice, all the 6 ice stacked on my remote. This is craziness at its finest here. And my opponent is being forced to making subpar plays like breaking Architect for 4 credits with a Fem just to get into R&D, and then playing a Mining Accident, which I shrug off pretty easily because I have a hedge fund and IPO in hand. Now the thing is, I want to close out this game before my opponent gets too much money. I see all the daily cards ticking down, and that's not good news for me. Even though I have a lot of ice stacked up and I could easily stack more ice with Jinja Grid on it, you really don't want to go too deep into the late game. Valencia can still deal with that very well. So here I play Hedge Fund and double advance the Ikawa for the win. My opponent sees that and they go immediately for a retrieval run. They have the combo going. They are going to Fem my Satyr Adaptive Barrier and Stim Hack into this 6 deep ice server. We don't get to see this every day, but Jinja Grid, you know, this is the new Semi-Rush Glacier. Now my opponent has to deal with potentially up to 6 pieces of ice. Let's start with the Fairchild 2. This costs 4 for me to res and 3 for my opponent to break. They are sacking one of their daily casts to trash one of the installed cards to get past one of the set routines. I'm going to do the same thing again. I lose 4, they lose 3. All the while I'm keeping track of the mental arithmetic. I want them to arrive at the bottom of the server with insufficient credits to beat my Ash trace, but at the same time must remember that the Ash costs 2 to res for me. So if you do the calculations against a 0-link runner, you will know that as the corp you can afford to be at most 3 credits poorer than the runner and still keep them out with the Ash. If you don't believe me, you can try the maths out for yourselves. What this means is that I can res another Fairchild 2 and then the Fairchild 3 and also the Fairchild 1 so that my opponent can't get through with enough to spare. Enough money to spare. The Satyr Adaptive Barrier is obviously not worth resing. For a res cost of 4, I can only tax my opponent 1. So that's a null ice right there. So here we go, the third Fairchild 2. I'm starting to lose money, but so is my opponent. All the Stim hack money has been drained by this point, and they're not even halfway through the server. This is exactly what you want. I do not rest the Fairchild 1 here, because my opponent could easily choose to trash 2 of their installed cards to get past the Fairchild 1, instead of paying 2 credits as I would like them to. So finally they reach the Fairchild 3. This is something they're forced to break with Black Orchestra because of the endurance routine, and all I have to do here is to rest the Ash to keep them out. Ash and boost the trace, of course. That would put it at trace 5. They only have 4 credits, so I did my mathematics exactly right. They were 1 credit short. They were, however, able to trash the Ash. However, this Valencia deck runs 2 Stim hacks. They have the other one in hand. My opponent is calculating to see whether they can get into the server once more. Now my opponent knows that this is the winning agenda for both of us. We are both on 4 points, so whoever scores this agenda wins the game. My opponent needs to keep in mind that this agenda is the Ikawa project, meaning they need to pay an extra 2 credits and a click to steal it, meaning they have to run on this 3rd click, and they must end the run with at least 2 clicks to spare. This is not possible with the Fairchild 2, Fairchild 2, Fairchild 2, Fairchild 3 server, because they if they have no more installed cards on the board, they are forced to pay 2 credits per subroutine on those Fairchild 2s. That will drain all their money and prevent them from stealing the Ikawa. Hence, Ikawa actually synergizes very well with the slew of Fairchilds you're running, because they cannot ignore the lose money or trash installed card subroutine. They either have to trash installed cards, and in my opponent's case, they've trashed basically their entire rig. Remember the 2 daily cast, the Liberator accounts, and the same old thing on the board? Well, they're gone. They are sacrificed to the Fairchild subroutines. So they can't ignore these subroutines anymore, because if they don't have installed cards to pay, they have to pay with credits, and without credits, they can't steal the Ikawa. My opponent realized this a tad too late as they made their way 1 ice into the server. They realized that there was no way they were going to escape this unscathed. So they have to end the Stim hack run prematurely, basically sealing up the game for me, with basically no installed resources left, and no cards in hand. They cannot threaten the win after this. One thing my opponent could have done, we discussed this after the game, was that they could have held on to their second Stim hack and use it next turn. That is because I was not able to score this Ikawa this very turn. Having spent all my money on the Ash Trace, I'm left with 1 credit at the start of my turn. So my opponent could have went for the Stim hack attack this turn, and probably would have won off it. However, they would have to respect the fact that I might have drawn into an Ash or Marcus Batty during this time to fortify the remote and prevent the second Stim hack from working. So a bit of a trade-off there, but my opponent failed to do the calculations beforehand and wasted the Stim hack on that remote. They attempt to Hail Mary and Omar run here, but I knew they were never going to win because there were no Ikawa projects left in the deck. This deck only runs 2 Ikawas, so at most my opponent's getting 2 agenda points, which is insufficient to win. However, they let me fire the Architect, so I'm just going to fire it anyway. Install Ash on Archives. Fun rules note here: Ash on Archives does not fire if it's an Omar run. Your Ash needs to be on R&D. So that's something I didn't know, but it didn't matter in the end. My opponent had no answer for this disgusting Fairchild remote, and I was able to easily close out the game by scoring this 5-3 agenda normally. The good old-fashioned way, just as you would do in those good old days. Compared to game number 1 that we featured last time, this game was entirely different. All because I drew Jinja City Grid early on, and that was all the difference I needed to win the game. This deck really preys on current top tier decks being inadequately prepared to contest such a taxing remote. One thing you realize about top tier decks post revised core, if you look at the World's 2017 championship decks and some of the store champ winning decks for example, is that their breakers are actually pretty crappy. Seriously, Golden Blade and Black Orchestra are not efficient at all by modern standards. You know, with the code gates having increased in power level, these breakers are still stuck in the dark ages. What these decks are relying on is that with these subpar breakers, they are able to still get their way through the remotes with Stim hack. But Jinja City Grid says no. This server costs easily into the double digits. If you look at the server I constructed this game, for example, even if you ignore the 2 ice in the middle that I did not res, the Satyr, Daphne Barrier, and the Fairchild 1, this 4 ice combo here requires 15 credits, 15 freaking credits for both these breakers to break. You cannot fork out that much money just to get one agenda. That is no go. Even if you get the agenda, you're opening a very easy scoring window for your opponent to jam the next agenda. And this is not accounting for any defensive upgrades yet. So yeah, these breakers are just very inefficient. And I think in the future, runners will have to at least reconsider their breaker suite in order to get around Jinja City Grid's sheer power. I think this is a game-changing card, and I hope this game has illustrated just that. I was able to play a very simple, straightforward game. Very transparent. I just showed my opponent all my ice. I just dropped them on the remote. My opponent knew what was on the server, and yet they couldn't do anything because they just weren't well prepared enough. I was able to overwhelm the runner with sheer efficiency from the clearances and Jinja City Grid. My agendas were scored overtly. This is a very refreshing change from the old times, the jammy decks that I used to play before this, where I needed to be very sneaky with how I handled remotes. I needed to use Never Advance Fodder to bait them into running a remote that doesn't have an agenda, to play mind games on the remote. No mind games here. I showed all my ice. I installed Double Advance my Ikawa, knowing that my opponent had no shot at getting into the remote. Well, that is kind of a lie. My opponent could have easily gotten this game had they held on the Stim Hack for one more turn, but even that was a pretty tough call to make. Still, this is a catalyst for a new breed of semi-rush glacier decks, and I firmly believe that Jinja Grid is going to be one of the more powerful cards that we'll see this cycle. So, well, I'm glad I got to showcase this here. Tune in next time when we conclude our 3-game showdown versus James Gray's Valencia. Until then, thanks for watching a Happy Net Running. See you next time.